So I'm going to bring up our MCs to fully introduce the next panel, which has great people from O'Reilly, Redhat, Mozilla, NGINX, and Datastax. But I forgot to say a couple words about our MCs. These are not just ordinary MCs. They are open source guys themselves. They started a company. They sold it to Mozilla. It was a cloud-based IDE, which Mozilla later sold to Cloud9. And then they started another company, which they sold to Walmart Labs, and now they're both VPs of mobile and open source at Walmart Labs. So if you could intro our next group.
Let's give a round of applause to Naval. Thanks, Salil. So our next panel, if the panelists could come up, I think they're already on their way. We have Diane Tate from Mozilla. We have Sarah Novotny from NGINX. We've got John Mark Walker from Redhat. Thank you, John. And we've got Christian Hasker from Datastax. And we've got a really interesting topic for this panel, I think.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really exciting to see. Whenever I look at a lot of the popular open source movements and the companies that come up around them, there's always that balance between community. How do you build this really vibrant, passionate community? And then what are you doing on the company side? So I'm personally really excited to see where this chat goes and how this community side and company side kind of come together.
Christian Perry, founder of SF Beta, will be moderating the panel. Christian, come on up and let's give the panel a warm welcome.
So we're just going to get right into it and talk about the importance that community plays in developing open source startups. And let's just start with like an open-ended question. What does community mean to you in your role? And why should it be on the minds of every founder who's starting an open source startup?
You want to say that
Go
one?
ahead, to my right.
Hi, so I'm Christian. I'm from Datastax, and really there would be no Datastax without open source community. It is that important to us, and the way that we structured our company is there is a commercial side, and there's the open source side, and it's sort of checks and balances. But really, the community is such a driver for us, and we spend so much time nurturing and helping them. There really would be no commercial Datastax entity without the open source community.
I think as a representative of NGINX, I'm Sarah Novotny. NGINX would be an internal piece of software in a very large Russian company that runs search if it weren't for the community. It was the fact that this bit of code was brought out further into a community who then found it compelling enough to translate language or translate all the documentation from Russian into many, many other languages that gave us the adoption over the last 10 years. We've only been a company and having a commercial product in the last 18 months or so. So NGINX would exist as a little bit of proprietary internal code if it weren't for the community.
I'm John Mark from Redhat. I've been the Gluster community leader for the last 3 years. I come at this with the opinion that open source communities are fundamentally different from other communities. Open source communities, the thing about open source is that it's pulled by customers. A lot of people think it's led by developers. I disagree with that. I think actually it's customers and users that made open source what it is. And they were able to do that because the nature of open source is that every player has kind of an equal stake in the game. And so it really changes that dynamic. In some companies that are proprietary, there's this one-way avenue of information exchange. In an open source community, it's multi-path. Everyone has a stake. Everyone can be a player at the table and sort of exert influence over the direction in the community. And so at Redhat, we take that to heart. We work with a lot of different open source communities, a lot of different open source projects, and we also happen to make great products that based on those. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to the innovation that happens in community because, I think, as a direct result of the fact that everyone is sort of an equal player in the game.
Great, I'm Diane, and I'm at Mozilla, and I agree with everything that's been said. For Mozilla, in the case of Mozilla, we were started by a group of people who were technical but also business oriented, and a community of people that really saw the need for a browser that was not dominated by a corporation. So there was definitely a lot of buy-in outside of the people starting the project. So that was our community, and it consisted not only of developers, but of people that just wanted to support us. So one of the first things that Mozilla did when we launched Firefox 1 was take an ad out in the New York Times, and we reached out to the community to finance the ad. So people could participate in the launch without having to write code. So in fact, it was so popular that we wound up doubling the size of the ad and listing absolutely everybody whose name, their name, who participated in financing the ad. So community takes on a number of forms at Mozilla beyond coding. It's marketing, evangelism, outreach, localization, documentation, a number of different things.
And how do you get all these people to do what you want them to? Or does it work the other way around?
The other way around.
Wow.
Exactly. So just like you were alluding to at Redhat, you know, it's a two-way, it's a collaboration. So we really like to work with people in terms of what they're passionate about, what they're gifted at, what they can contribute. And Mozilla does have a structure. It's called a module ownership structure, so it's not pure chaos. Things do have to ship, things do have to get done. So there is sort of a governance in place, but at the same time, it's definitely a contributive, collaborative effort, and it's shaped by everybody involved.
Your work product is your vote. Just do what needs to be done, contribute to the community, involve yourself in it. And as Diane said, there are so many ways beyond just code.
Yeah, there's the whole concept of community equity that you build up over time because of the things that you contribute. A lot of people will want to drop in and create this huge document about stuff that the community should do, and everyone will ignore that person because who are they? Who cares? They haven't been there, day to day doing stuff. So, are we actually going to disagree here, or is this going to be a love fest? Which is fine, by the way.
I think you should show up and troll.
Excellent.
That happens in communities.
Well, let's talk about the difference between building a community as an open source startup as opposed to an open source project. I think that one of the interesting ideas behind being an open source startup with a really active community of contributors is that there's an interesting matrix of incentives, and not everybody shares the same one. Sarah, can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So as far as I look at these things, open source communities can exist in a couple of different ways. They can grow very organically from the start of it's an idea and then my friends play with it and then it grows outward. Or you can have companies who start with an open source piece of code. And I differentiate between open source code and an open source project because you are missing the community if it's just open source code. So open source code is fundamentally some code, it does some cool thing, it's got an open source license attached to it. Great. That's very different from an open source project, which has that community. And an open source startup starts with an idea, starts with code, starts with a license, and then has to find the community, has to find that voice, has to find that contribution. And we're lucky at NGINX, we flipped it. We found the community and the project first, and we've built the company around that and are figuring out how to make that shift, because that's still a very different space from trying to have just the project.
It's incredibly hard. I'm going through the process right now, taking a proprietary product and turning it to open source one. It's not easy. It's not just as simple as taking code and throwing it over the wall and under an open source license. There's so much of open source is around process and governance. Like those are, to me, way more important than software license. It's really about what processes do you have in place. And I think there's a really interesting dynamic when you look at projects that start off open source versus products that start off as proprietary and try to go the other way. The process itself of being in an open source community drives how that software is created. And so it becomes a lot more easily integrated into a data center. It's a lot easier for people to take it and actually do stuff with it. Whereas a lot of proprietary code is developed with proprietary developer environments, stuff that can't be used by normal humans in an ordinary environment. It has to have all the stuff baked into the build process. And so that alone takes up a whole lot of time. So I guess the point here is that when you start off from two different sides, open source and proprietary, you end up with a vastly different end product.
How do you go from one to the other?
We're ask me in 2 months.
I will do that.
I was involved at a previous company doing something similar, and we were a proprietary software company, and we open sourced a project and did not really understand everything that meant, and it failed. I mean, just because something is open source does not mean it's open source, and we did not have the commitment up and down that you're talking about. And I think the thing with open source is it is a philosophical shift for a lot of companies, and you cannot fake it, and you have to be in it for the long haul. There is no quick, oh, here's my instant open source community tab.
Did Datastax start as a company or as a community?
Yeah, so Jonathan Ellis, who is the founder of Datastax, he is the Apache project chair for Cassandra, which is an open source NoSQL database. So he had already adopted Cassandra and had a paternal outlook on the project before Datastax was founded. So we were definitely founded as an open source company first and community first. And actually in all of our meetings, it's always community first. That's really the way that things get decided.
And I just to tack on to a lot of these comments, it's more than just flipping a switch and being open source. It requires a lot of commitment. So yes, there are many benefits that you get from being open, but don't treat your community as a market or as something that's just going to serve you, right? So it's a huge commitment to a process that takes a lot of cultivation and investment of time and resources. So you need to be bought into the philosophy to make it work. It needs to be a genuine extension of what your business model is and what you care about as a business.
The change from proprietary to open is about on the same order as going from waterfall to agile. I really think it's the same degree of change in philosophy for the developers. I've never seen such fear in a person's eyes as when I told proprietary developers, we're going to open source your code. Pure fear. It was
Why?
Pure.
What are they afraid of?
That's a great question. Like, I don't know what they're afraid of because I live in this world, and so to me it's like second nature. But for them, it's like, oh my God, people are going to see how bad my code is, and so they think like, oh my God, I have to make it perfect before we can release it, and that's like going way too far in the other direction. But yeah, it's striking fear in their hearts.
Well, on the flip side, doesn't that improve the code review process?
One hopes, yes.
Globally.
So one of the ways, I'm also program chair for OSCON, and so I look at a lot of different communities and a lot of different people that work within open source. And one of the ways I've sort of started categorizing people and groups and organizations that are trying to work in open source is there are the open source dogmatists, and those are the people that it is free, absolutely, this is the FSF, we can't possibly use Google documents because there's proprietarily compiled JavaScript in front of it. Or GitHub, et cetera, et cetera. So they're the open source pragmatists who see the benefits of the open source community, want to contribute, find it, oh God, I'm going to sound businessy, find a synergistic relationship there. And then there are the open source opportunists who take a project and go, well, this is kind of cool, but I don't want to work, I don't want to maintain it. Over the wall, we'll make it open source and presume that they'll get free development time out of it.
The community will take it, right?
Right, the community will run it, it'll be great. Yeah, so
Does that actually happen?
Once or twice. Okay. I can think of a couple, and sometimes the community does. Actually, Cassandra is a good one. The community did take care of it. It was hucked over the wall and kind of left there.
Yeah, it was abandoned by
by its original authors. But you from there have, you do have communities sometimes taking them on, but the opportunists are I want to say I open sourced something, as opposed to I want to own and nurture and grow or participate in a community and see it take on a life of its own.
John,
we try and talk to our sales reps actually about being part of the community. And for them, I apologize, by the way, if you get called by our sales reps. They don't get it. It's anathema to them. I don't know if you have the same experience, but it's really interesting.
They have different incentives, and one of the things about community is you have to align incentives. So if their incentives were adoption, not cash, then it would look very different.
Right. Every startup I've been at, the sales guy comes up to me and says, our number one competitor is our open source project. Yes. How do we kill that? No, you're not getting it.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you incentivize the community? What are some tactics and strategies that you found have worked for you?
I can speak to Mozilla, but Mozilla It's definitely a mission. So it's absolutely the mission that we have around keeping the web open and accessible and not commercially controlled by one entity, whether it's government or business. So it's really the mission that we always point back to because we're extremely diverse. We have people all over the world. 98% of the languages are localized in Firefox. So it's culturally, linguistically, religions, everything. We span the globe. So it's really the mission.
I would say that, going back to the comment about proprietary versus open, proprietary developers, before they open it, they want to make sure it's perfect. There's this drive to have the code be perfect and to have everything be done. And I would say, leave some loose ends. Leave some things for people who want to participate and come in and do. I think that's really important. If people come in and they see this really polished thing that apparently doesn't need anything, they're going to feel like, oh, okay, I'm just going to download this thing and be done. But have some stuff that people can take a bite out of and do.
But I mean, how do you say hey, some random person who writes code or wants to be a contributor, work on my project as opposed to the 10 million others on GitHub? What's the meat that really drives somebody to work on your startup for you?
What's in it for them?
What's in it for them?
Well, usually they come by and they actually find your stuff useful, and that's the first step, right? It has to be usable and something that solves a problem for them, and then that's how they get the initial hook, and then from there it can go many different directions.
Since I'm relatively new to the NGINX community specifically, what I have been spending some of the last several months doing is trying to figure out what need we are serving, to whom, how people are pleased with what they're contributing, where they want to contribute more, and finding out ways to align the company to the community's choices like that, and trying to figure out can we make more sales, because this is still a company, by doing something differently within the community, by providing something else. So I've been doing it from the flip side, trying to find out why people have been incented instead of knowing at this point what it is, because I'm new to the community.
Yeah, happenstance is a very powerful driver in community land because I can think of 2 instances in the last year where some guy just showed up on our doorstep and said, hey, we've developed this thing. What do you think? And we're like, oh my God, we're going to do that in 2 years, but we didn't have people to do that. This is awesome. You never know what's going to happen. 2 things happen in open source with regard to happenstance. Developers show up unexpectedly, but also people start to use your software in ways that you never foresaw because you didn't place limitations on the way they could use it. And that, I think, is also very powerful in shaping future direction for what you're doing.
Have you ever encountered communities mutinying on a project?
Not NGINX, but yes.
Not on my projects.
I can come up with several mutinying projects, all of them around a couple of acquisitions. My primary community 10 years ago was MySQL, and I'll just leave it at that.
So I do think in open source communities, or at least our community, fork really is a 4-letter word. It doesn't really, in the long run, it doesn't really benefit anyone. So I think openness, honesty, transparency, you really have to have more than just one person driving a vision. Everyone has to feel included. Otherwise, you do, the flip side of a successful open source community is one that's just splintered and fragmented and people are pissed off, and that's no good for anyone. So we spend a lot of time trying to keep everyone involved and really having them have a lot of input.
We have a question. I don't know if you want to stop for questions now.
Let's do one more, and then we'll jump to Q&A. What are some of the tips? What are some of the actual services, software, tools that you use to drive and encourage engagement?
Bugzilla. It's not a beautiful tool, but it is used by not only Mozilla, but NASA and a number of organizations use it. But the idea is that anyone can use it, and so it's easy to learn. It's like I said, it's not beautiful, but it's easy to learn, and it's a universal way for people to plug in, start reading notes about things, and by the way, it involves a lot more than just bugs. It's called Bugzilla, but it also has feature requests, and it's a core tool that everyone can just plug into, so it's kind of a universal leveler for the Mozilla project.
Ours is our IRC on Freenode is just, pop in there anytime, and it's pretty fun.
And ours is more mailing lists and forums. We're a little bit more old school. IRC, but time zone challenges with the Moscow development team mean you have to be a really late staying up West Coast person if you're going to overlap.
We're mainly
Aren't we
West
all?
too, don't feel bad.
It's okay.
For the longest time, one of the standard stacks has been MediaWiki, WordPress, and Mailman. Recently, I've seen more of a migration away from mailing lists to web-based forums. AskBot is one that comes up a lot for us. I don't know if you guys are seeing the same sort of thing.
Well, the other note I would say is that there's definitely no silver bullet. Like I imagine, so given that a community is bound to be diverse or geographically distributed, different time zones, typically I think most communities require like 5 different tools, and that's part of the maintenance and the love and the care and the investment of time that we all mentioned. A lot of it has to do with just communicating in different ways, in different times, repeating your message, different channels. So that's why you have people dedicated to cultivating the community. It's not just, I emailed it, so why didn't you get the email? There's usually a lot of different ways you need to maintain that.
And don't try and force a communication mechanism on them.
That was going to be my next point.
Go where they are already.
Yes. If your developers or your community all collect on Stack Overflow, you will learn, live, and love Stack Overflow.
We've got about 5 minutes for questions, and we're going to have 2 wireless mics floating around. So if you'd like to jump in the conversation, just raise your hand, and we will give you the floor. Go ahead.
So yeah, I was wondering how you keep developers incentivized to work on these open source projects. I mean, we've got to eat, right? So where's the money come from?
So for us, it's really easy. It goes to what you were saying about they've adopted this technology because it solves a pain for them. Inevitably, because it's a maturing technology, there are holes in it that they need to fill, and that's usually the primary driver. We want more people committing and feeling that they can really influence the direction, but there's usually some identified pain that they're trying to solve in their organization.
And part of that is also making it as painless for them and trying to solve their pain. So it means, in addition to all the communications mechanisms, we call things pathways to participation. So giving them very discrete, manageable, easily identifiable ways to participate, especially if they're new to the project. So that's not a labyrinth of information, but just making it very clear about what they can do as a first step. Giving them feedback and quick feedback, especially when they're early, and then supporting them through documentation so that, again, it's not a labyrinth of Byzantine information.
We're going to jump to Salil's question.
So the specific problem you referred to of salespeople feeling that the open source competes with the paid version, how do you address that? Is that a product problem? Is there not enough differentiation between the paid version and the community version?
I think we have a respondent.
We're just going through how to differentiate the open source product from the closed source product, and we're trying to find out if customers are more interested in additional features, which then piss off your open source community, or if they're interested in support and services, which only scale linearly with people. Well, support not so much, services certainly. Support is more like an insurance model. Or if they're interested in training, again, we're scaling fairly linearly. And the answer is, sadly, yes, all of these things. Some customers buy it for the additional features. Some open source devotees are really unhappy that that feature went into the closed source version. And we have to balance all of those, but for us it seems to be further differentiation, finding out what that differentiation is. We have one particular feature that went into the enterprise product that is probably going to end up backported into the open source because we chose wrong. And so finding those out and being gracious within the community, within your user groups, within your developer community, and saying, being able to address when you make those mistakes, I think is one of the things that helps the sales in both cases, because you say, I did this right, I did this wrong, give me feedback. And I'm really lucky our sales guy gets it. He gets that further adoption means at some point they need support on something, they'll call us, and he's plenty willing to wait. So I'm very lucky in that case.
And open source community development and sales are always in tension because sales is short-term motivated and community development is long-term incented. So tension is good. And what we try to coach our reps on is those open source zealots who are never going to buy from you does not mean they're useless to you. You can help them. They will talk to someone else. They see the need for software and tools just because they don't need it themselves. And it's a really hard shift for reps coming from Oracle or SAP or, it's like, whoa, you blew my mind. But they get it eventually.
They can be advocates who then teach or share with people who need the support. So there is an amplifying effect that way.
I have a whole slide dedicated to the value of freeloaders. Because it came up so many times. You walk that line constantly in an open source project. There's no easy answer. Infrastructure software lends itself to a model that's adoption-led, where eventually they use enough of it that they need to pay you because so much of their infrastructure is riding on software that you provide. So if they don't pay you, they're stupid. But not all software lends itself to that. So there are a variety of models, and you just have to choose the one that works best.
That pretty much gets us for time. I think we have time for one more question. Or not. Let's just have lunch. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for staying and for an awesome discussion. And yeah, yay, community.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.